Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Employment and Tourism, it is my privilege to welcome you to this workshop and forum discussion on the role of science diplomacy in informed decision-making at the science policy interface, held as a part of the National Science Day 2025. We also warmly welcome our virtual participants joining us from universities, ministries, international organizations, and research institutions across Sri Lanka and abroad. Today's forum celebrates the spirit of science diplomacy, a bridge between knowledge and policy, between scientists and diplomats, and between nations working towards shared global challenges. As the world faces climate change, energy transitions, pandemics, and biodiversity loss, diplomacy guided by science has become essential for sustainable and inclusive development. This afternoon, we bring together a distinguished group of scientists, policymakers, and diplomats to explore how science diplomacy can strengthen evidence-based decision-making and advance Sri Lanka's engagement in global scientific cooperation. And ladies and gentlemen, to inaugurate the proceedings, it is my honor to invite Mr. Samantha Pathirana, Director General, South Asia and SAARC, representing Ms. Aruni Ranaraja, Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Employment and Tourism, to deliver the opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Foreign Secretary Mrs. Aruni Ranaraja was expected today, but due to some disposition, she's unable to make it. So I will, Mr. Mohammad Nawawi, Secretary, Minister of Science and Technology, distinguished delegates, panelists, policymakers, members of the scientific community, diplomats, international partners, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Employment and Tourism, I wish to express our sincere appreciation to the Ministry of Science and Technology for organizing this timely initiative. This event reflects the strong commitment of the Ministry of Science and Technology to develop evidence-based policy making and promoting the use of science, technology and innovation in addressing national and global challenges. Today's gathering is not only a celebration of National Science Week, but also an opportunity to reflect on how science and diplomacy, when working hand in hand, can advance informed decision-making and promote sustainable development. We meet at a time when the world faces vulnerabilities on multiple fronts. The challenges before us are profound: climate change, global health crisis, economic disparities, and technological divides. These demand not only robust policies, but also an urgent acceleration of action. With just 5 years remaining to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, our progress on this front has been deeply inadequate. Only 35% of SDG targets are currently on track or making moderate progress. Nearly half of the targets are showing insufficient progress, and alarmingly, 18% are in reverse. This sobering reality calls for renewed engagement and collaboration. It compels us to strengthen our interactions with global communities to confront the pressing challenges of our time, including climate change, widespread poverty, and food insecurities. These efforts require both scientific innovation and international cooperation. This is where science diplomacy can play a transformative role, serving as a bridge that connects nations through knowledge, strengthening trust among communities, and ensuring that scientific evidence guides diplomatic dialogue and policy actions, serving as a tool for partnership. The Ministry of Science and Technology has taken a decisive step in recognizing the importance of the interface and institutionalizing science diplomacy within the national framework. By organizing this forum in collaboration with UNESCO TWAS, the World Academy of Science, the Ministry has created a vital platform for policymakers, researchers, diplomats, and international partners to share experiences and chart new pathways for cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, Sri Lanka remains deeply committed to advancing science diplomacy as a means of strengthening international cooperation and informed decision making within the United Nations and across regional organizations such as BIMSTEC, SAARC, and the Indian Ocean Rim Association. Sri Lanka has consistently advocated for the integration of scientific expertise into diplomatic dialogue and policy formulation. To mention some of our key achievements, Sri Lanka has played an instrumental role in international maritime governance, most notably through its contribution to the development of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Most recently, Sri Lanka deposited the instrument of ratification on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, where we actively engage since the inception of discussions. Sri Lanka was globally recognized by UN for rebuilding mangrove ecosystems and declared as a UN World Restoration flagship in recognition of the nation's vital efforts to rebuild and restore its mangrove ecosystems. Further, Sri Lanka has a long-standing collaboration with UNESCO on science cooperation in areas such as STEM education, water resource management, conservation of biosphere reserves, science popularization, and institutional development. Sri Lanka also currently serves as the designated lead country for the science, technology, and innovation sector under BIMSTEC. Guided by our long-standing tradition of multilateral engagement, we continue to champion initiatives that link scientific research with sustainable development, climate resilience, ocean governance, education, and public health. In this connection, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Employment, and Tourism works closely with the Ministry of Science and Technology and international partners to promote capacity building, knowledge exchange, and the inclusion of developing countries in global scientific networks. As an island nation, which is rich in biodiversity and innovation potential, Sri Lanka recognizes that science diplomacy not only advances national interests, but also contributes to global peace, prosperity, and shared progress. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Employment, and Tourism stands ready to continue its collaborative and support these efforts. Through our diplomatic missions abroad, we will continue to facilitate connections between Sri Lankan research institutes, universities, and innovation networks with their international counterparts, while advancing science diplomacy agenda through the UN agencies and regional and international fora. We also seek to strengthen our ties with expatriate Sri Lankan scientists who can serve as invaluable bridges between local capabilities and global excellence. Diplomacy, in this context, complements science. It provides the communication channels, negotiation skills, and frameworks of trust needed to translate scientific knowledge into policy outcomes that benefit society. Science diplomacy is ultimately about building bridges not only between nations, but also between ideas, evidence, and policy guided by our shared commitment to a better future. Let this forum stand as a milestone in Sri Lanka's journey towards science diplomacy, complementing national development, global engagement, and sustainable progress. I once again congratulate the Ministry of Science and Technology for its initiative and leadership in organizing this important event, and express sincere appreciation to UNESCO TWAS for its partnership and contribution. I warmly welcome all participants and invite you to share your insights and ideas as we work together to advance science diplomacy for the benefit of Sri Lanka and the wider global community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pathirana. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to welcome our keynote speaker, Tan Sri Emeritus Professor Sakri Abdul Hamid. Professor Hamid is a distinguished Malaysian scientist and a global leader in science diplomacy, biodiversity, and sustainable development. A key architect of international environmental policy, he was the founding chair of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and one of the original negotiators of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. He has served as science advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia, director of the UN University's Institute of Advanced Studies, and a member of the UN Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board. Currently, he is the founding director and distinguished professor at the International Institute for Science Diplomacy and Sustainability at UCSI University, as well as joint chair of the Malaysian Industry Government Group for High Technology and chairman of the Business Council for Sustainable Development, Malaysia. Internationally, Professor Sakri serves as ambassador and science advisor to WISE Foundation and National Geographic's 3030 Campaign for Nature. Vice Chair of the UN Technology Bank for Least Developed Countries and founding fellow of the International Science Council. His numerous honors include the Merdeka Award, ASEAN Biodiversity Hero Award, and Zaid International Prize for the Environment. 3 species, a beetle, a cicada, and a pitcher plant, bear his name, recognizing his lifelong commitment to linking science, policy, and environmental sustainability. And ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sakri will now deliver his keynote address virtually on addressing the global challenges through collective cross-border STI efforts. Over to you, Professor.
Can you hear me? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the topic that was given this
Recording
title
in progress.
to a bit more comment. Next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, so we are really talking about science diplomacy in action. Next slide. And I'm speaking from some of my experience extending nearly 40 years as a science diplomat. And that would include to be negotiator of a couple of UN treaties, namely the UN Biodiversity Treaty and the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. And as you can see from the list here, I have quite a number of experience internationally, which also include the founding chair of this intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, or IBES. I'm also a former science advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia and former member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon. So given that experience, I'm very comfortable to share with you some of my insights. Next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that I want to draw your attention to is why all these mega meetings. So this is a picture of heads of state, head of governments attending one of the COP, Conference of Parties of Climate Change, in Dubai about 2 years ago. So it's not only science, but we are going to see this lecture, you're going to hear in this lecture how science would influence the policy making work. Next slide. Next slide. So this is the problem that we are having today. Let's set the stage of the world. This is the reason of these global challenges, and that includes, ladies and gentlemen, of course, global warming or climate change. Next slide. Next slide. So, in fact, this picture here, it depicts each of those small yellow dots. That's a plane moving on the surface of the earth as we are speaking. Can you imagine that? So this slide, ladies and gentlemen, depicts how humankind have conquered the planet. We have really taken over from other forces. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this cartoon here shows you the magnitude of the global challenges. Used to be just the COVID that we have experienced several years ago, then the recession. But there are bigger waves. One of that is climate change. And the bigger one, which is less spoken than climate change, is biodiversity collapse. You know, a few years ago in 2019, there was an assessment that showed that almost 1 million species of plants and animals are subject to extinction. And that is a very grave global challenge. Next slide. And this is the state of our planets, ladies and gentlemen: climate change, biodiversity loss, and a host of social and economic problems. Next slide. What is happening now is the fact that we are living in the situation from a 20th century infinite Earth to a 21st century finite Earth. And this is due to human activities. Ladies and gentlemen, you must have heard about Mahatma Gandhi's saying, there's enough for everyone's needs, but that's not enough for everyone's greed. In other words, someone was saying, the way we are living now, the human style of human life, it's not enough to just to have one planet, but 3 more planets. Next slide. Hello. Hello. There's some disturbance in the background. Ladies and gentlemen, this slide here depicts one of the aspirations of the world, and that is the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that was ironed out in 2015, and we hope to achieve it by 2030. Something which is not very encouraging for the moment. These include many things like no poverty, no hunger, gender equality, education, and so on. Very ambitious. Yeah. Next slide. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure as we speak, you must have heard of this COP or COP30, which is being launched today on the 10th of November in Belém, uh, in Brazil. This is an ongoing outcome of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was agreed during the next slide, during the first summit in 1992. So, next slide. We have gone at the Rio summit in 1992. You must have heard that this is one of the first mega meetings convened by the United Nations to address sustainable issues facing our civilization. So during that time, the UN Convention on Climate Change was agreed upon. Next slide. So this is the first time. This is also a great example of science diplomacy in action, because who are attending this Earth Summit is not only the heads of governments but also scientists, negotiators, and all. So it's really a good example of multilateral diplomacy. Next slide. And one of the outcome of the summit was this UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is due to, one, the input of science. There was a scientific consensus 2 years earlier, before 1992, of the assessment by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where the evidence was huge that human activities cause global warming, and hence we need this international action. So this is one example of science diplomacy in action. Next slide. And the key milestone of this climate change treaty are the following. Beside the agreement in 1992, there was the Kyoto Protocol, in which developed countries have to contribute towards global warming, to slow down global warming. And the most big milestone was the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, which also coincide with the SDGs number 13, that is on climate change in 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, here again is an example of science diplomacy at work, whereby the policymakers, the decision makers, the political leaders make decisions based on sound science developed by the scientific community. In the case of climate change, it's of course the IPCC. Next slide. Yes, COP1 was in Berlin, 1995. Next slide. And the latest one is COP30 in Belém, in Brazil, for 2 weeks. Next slide. And this is just a warning. This is also how science advice come into being. This is the infamous IPCC assessment report released in 2021, where it was proposed, it was stressed that human activity is unequivocally warming the atmosphere, ocean, land, and that recent climate change is unprecedented in centuries to millennia. But why it's important? Because it laid out the scientific basis that we cannot go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.0. And we have to do that with deep emissions cut. Next slide. So just to summarize here, global challenges like climate change is very complex, multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary, and multinational. Hence the need for a multilateral approach predicated on science, because science has the explanation for it. Next slide. Why science diplomacy? Science diplomacy is the use of scientific knowledge, expertise, and cooperation to advance national interests. But it has to build on international partnership. So we need a lot of collaboration. Next slide. Very quickly, ladies and gentlemen, there are three types of science diplomacy originally, and one is science for diplomacy. These are examples about how scientists and policymakers collaborate on Antarctica, where is the neutral ground, really the cold continent. There's also example of tsunami surveillance network. This is the role for diplomacy. But there's also the role for diplomacy for science. And this is example establishing large research infrastructure like CERN, Sesame, and UNESCO meeting. Here, the project Sesame is very interesting, where many countries in the Middle East, including Israel and Palestine, work together, for the progress of science, still ongoing. And the third one is science in diplomacy, which is exemplified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the other one, the IPBES on biodiversity, where the scientific community fed the diplomatic community with advice for them to make the right decision. There's also the fourth one, where the interaction between science and diplomacy in science. Next slide. Here, where it's really interactive process, where science and diplomacy are deeply intertwined. Science affect diplomacy, but the diplomatic community also advise science. In a sense, it is not neutral. Next slide. So let's see one example here, science impacting diplomacy. And this is using science to inform policy and to facilitate scientific collaboration. This is happening in the world of climate change and also biodiversity. Next slide. Diplomacy impacting science. So I can also say here, diplomacy is not, science diplomacy is not just science, yeah? It's really about a dialogue between the scientists and the policy-making world, because sometimes the science advice has to be tempered by the needs of countries. I'll come to that when I talk about the global south and the global north. Next slide. In other words, science opens the door, but diplomacy decides how wide the door can be. What we meant by here, there's always a limit that science can do. For instance, science can say, don't open up the forest. But for people in developing countries, sometimes you have to open up the forest for economic activities. I'll elaborate that more towards the end. Next slide. Diplomacy impacting science and science impacting diplomacy are really two sides of the same coin. Next slide. Just to show even my experience here since 30 years ago, this is a picture of the Malaysian delegation negotiating the Convention on Biological Diversity in Nairobi. Next slide. And here we are at COP27 many years ago, from the original date of 1992. This is our negotiating team at the meeting of climate change in Egypt in COP27. Next. So diplomacy impacts science when political or economic consideration dictate scientific priorities. So politics is always in the way. So it's up to the meeting to negotiate between the two. International treaties define what can or cannot be researched, and that also follows the funding that comes with it. Next slide. This is one great example of science diplomacy in action, where through the advice given by the expert, the decision makers, the diplomats decided to have this watershed treaty or pact in 2015 in Paris. Next slide. This is just an example on how science diplomacy has been in action for quite some time, from the Cold War era to the climate era. At one time, during the Cold War from the 40s to the 1960s, scientists from both the superpowers were working closely, but at the same time, when they were at loggerheads, and there was at one time a threat for nuclear warfare, the close collaboration of the scientists in Soviet Union and the US has been able to avoid nuclear calamity. In the 70s and 90s, these are time when global bodies like UNESCO were established to facilitate this dialogue between the scientists and the politicians. And of course, to this, in the 2000s and the 20s, we have the issue of climate change on sustainability problem. And this gave rise to a big focus on the sustainable development. Next slide. Yeah, I've discussed this, the example of the Paris Agreement. And, this is a very interesting example because global warming or climate change is really started by the industrialized countries, but the impact were felt quite acutely by people in the developing countries. So this science diplomacy agreement, like the Paris Accord, try to level the playing field, and one of that is the so-called nationally determined contribution, or the NDCs, in which each country would declare to what extent they can contribute to reduce global warming. And that also follows into scientific pursuit like renewable energy, carbon capture, and also climate finance, of course. Scientists actually. We must treat science as both strategic and collaborative. Negotiators must balance national interests with global goods. Important element here is to build trust through scientific exchange. Next slide. For the academics in the arena of diplomacy, implication for academic. Research agendas are most often shaped by international funding and treaties. A caution to scientists in the room: scientists must be diplomatically literate. This means science can only advise so much. There's also a limitation, in particular, countries in the global south, which has a lot of handicaps. So, what can be implemented in the northern, in the global north, may not be applied in the global south. Scientists must also understand negotiation processes. What I mean here is any advice that's given should be policy prescriptive, where the political leaders can implement, and not be policy. Uh, the advice should be policy relevant, that it can be applied by the politician. But it should never be policy prescriptive. So scientists should never talk down to the policymakers or the political leaders. We should also engage in science advice for policy, but eventually we must recognize the transdisciplinarity of issues, the cross-border effect, which calls for the need for networks. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, in today's age of sustainability and in facing the challenges by the global community, it is time that this norm about publish or perish should be diminished to policy or perish. What I'm saying here, research done at the universities or public research institution must not only for the sake of producing peer-reviewed papers, but policy, publishing recommendation that can be applied to manage national challenges, regional issues, and eventually global issues like climate change. Because the situation is very dire. Relevance is so important. Next slide. One aspect here, very quickly, science advice to governments. I talk about a lot of the multilateral aspect, but the science policy nexus has to operate also at the national level. Next slide. Very quickly, it is a complex relationship between science and policy making, how scientific evidence is used to inform policy decision. Next slide. This is a very interesting element, in particular for us from developing countries. I show here an example in a developing country is actually mine in Malaysia. You know, Malaysia is the second top producer of palm oil in the world after Indonesia. And the palm oil was once imported from West Africa, of course, and it has thrived very well. So one of the criticism is why are we involved in deforestation of our pristine tropical forests, like what we see here in the right-hand side of my picture. So it's a question of balance between conservation on one hand, between keeping our forest pristine, and also the need to create more income for the people and jobs for the people. In fact, by creating this plantation, we are already practicing one of the SDGs and elevating poverty. Yeah, but That is the controversy. So, to what extent we must implement this? I would argue that there should be a balance. If we need to create jobs, if we need to open up a bit of our forests, we should do so. But at the same time, we must respect the need to maintain some of these natural areas for conservation. Next slide. Just one example, in Malaysia itself, there's a lot of activities on the science policy nexus or science diplomacy. Here is a picture of the Prime Minister of Malaysia chairing the National Science Council, and also he chairs the National Action Council on climate change. So we take cognizance of the needs expounded by the international community, but we also take care of our own interests. In some ways, like Malaysia, we profess to implement the net zero by 2050. We also have national energy transition roadmap, national policy on climate change. All those mirrors what are being required globally, but it's tailored towards our national agenda. So with that, next slide. I think I've come to the end of my talk, just to say that diplomacy can both empower and can also constrain science. The challenge is to keep science open amid rising geopolitics. And the call to action is for diplomats to understand, to show understanding, and to support scientific cooperation. But the academics also must engage with policy processes so that they know what are the priorities for each country. So, science without borders, ladies and gentlemen, needs diplomacy without barriers. And we, science and diplomacy, share a mission to safeguard humanity's future. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sakri, for your inspiring keynote. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Dr. Timothy Curtis. Dr. Curtis. Dr. Curtis is the director of the UNESCO New Delhi Regional Office, overseeing activities in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, and Maldives. With over 2 decades of international experience in culture, he has led major UNESCO programs on heritage preservation, culture policy, and sustainable development. Since joining UNESCO in 2000, he has served in key roles worldwide, including program specialist in Tanzania, head of the culture unit in Bangkok, and chief of the Intangible Culture Heritage section at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, where he also acted as secretary of the Convention for Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. Appointed director of the New Delhi office in 2023, Dr. Curtis now leads UNESCO's regional initiatives across South Asia. He holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the Australian National University, specializing in oral history and plays in Vanuatu. Ladies and gentlemen, he will now speak on International Scientific Cooperation for Sustainable Development. Over to you, Dr. Curtis.
Thank you. And greetings, everyone. On behalf, of course, of UNESCO, but of the broader UN family, it's really a privilege to be joining you today for this National Science Day Forum. A gathering, I think, that reaffirms our shared belief that science, diplomacy, and informed decision-making are really key to rebuilding the trust, to advancing cooperation, and shaping solutions for people and the planet. So I'd like to extend my deep gratitude to the organizers, to all the scientific institutions and partners for convening this meeting of what I believe is a critical moment. A moment where the world is looking to science for answers, to diplomacy for unity, and to knowledge for hope. Because here is a sobering truth. In an age when we can sequence a genome in hours, when we can predict weather patterns weeks in advance, and we can communicate instantly across continents, public trust in science is declining. So today's forum cannot just be about celebrating scientific achievement. It must be about reaffirming our collective commitment to ensuring that science serves everyone, that it is inclusive, that it is ethical, and that it is accessible to all. And that is in many ways why science diplomacy matters now, perhaps more than ever. Across the world, as I mentioned, we are witnessing a crisis of trust in science. Disinformation, politicization, and unequal access to knowledge have weakened public confidence precisely when global cooperation is most needed. And precisely at a time when humanity faces what the Secretary General has called the triple planetary crisis, which we heard about earlier, the crisis of climate change, of biodiversity loss, and pollution. These intertwined threats, of course, transcend borders and can only be addressed through collective responsibility and international solidarity. And this does require a new diplomacy of truth, where evidence guides action and cooperation transcends division. So what do we mean by science diplomacy, and why does it matter today? And as we heard earlier, at its core, science diplomacy operates at three interconnected levels. Firstly, science in diplomacy, where evidence informs foreign policy decisions. When the UN Security Council considers climate-related security threats, or when nations negotiate pandemic preparedness treaties, they rely on scientific consensus to reach agreements that affect millions of lives. Secondly, of course, diplomacy for science, where diplomatic channels facilitate international scientific cooperation. This, for example, is what enabled the International Space Station, where astronauts from nations with strained relations worked side by side. And it's what allows the ITER nuclear fusion project to unite 35 countries in pursuit of clean, limitless energy. And then, of course, science for diplomacy, as was mentioned also earlier, where scientific cooperation builds bridges between nations, creating channels of communication. Scientific exchanges between the United States and the Soviet Union were perhaps the only way of keeping dialogue alive. Today, and we heard earlier, institutions like Sesame in Jordan are still bringing together scientists from Israel, Palestine, Iran, Turkey, and other Middle Eastern nations, proving that shared scientific inquiry and curiosity can transcend conflict. Diplomacy is essential today because the challenges we face are borderless. A pathogen emerging in one country becomes a global pandemic within weeks. Carbon emissions in one hemisphere drive sea level rise, affecting island nations thousands of miles away. Cybersecurity threats and space debris affect all nations, regardless of their technological capacity. And artificial intelligence developed in one region shapes labor markets, privacy norms, and security worldwide. So these challenges cannot be solved by any one single nation or two nations, no matter how powerful they are. And they do demand what the Secretary General has called network multilateralisms, where governments, scientists, civil society, and the private sector collaborate across traditional boundaries. And the UN system does provide a unique platform for this collaboration. And within the UN system, UNESCO has a distinctive mandate as the UN specialized agency for science. But our role goes beyond coordination or convening. It is also to actively set global normative frameworks that guide how nations develop and deploy science responsibly. So through landmark instruments like the Recommendation on Open Science, UNESCO has championed the principle that research should be transparent, it should be inclusive and accessible, rather than locked behind paywalls or national borders. And this isn't just idealism. It's a pragmatic recognition that humanity's greatest challenges require humanity's collective. In March of this year, 2025, UNESCO held a global ministerial dialogue on science diplomacy, the first of its kind, bringing together high-level representatives, science ministers from across the world to address how we strengthen international scientific cooperation in times of rising geopolitical tension and questioning of the multilateral system. I'll come back to that later, but of course UNESCO works within the broader UN system, of which many agencies are deeply engaged with science diplomacy. The World Health Organization demonstrated science diplomacy in action, from coordinating the global response to COVID-19 to other lesser known networks such as the effort to eradicate polio, or establishing genomic surveillance networks and data sharing that detect emerging pathogens before they become pandemics. UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, regularly translates scientific assessments into actionable policy through their annual emissions gap report, which doesn't just measure climate progress, but creates a kind of diplomatic pressure and political will for more ambitious action. And there are others, the IAEA, UNDP, FAO, who all use science in the work for multilateral diplomacy. But we must be honest about the obstacles we face. And the recent ministerial dialogue on science diplomacy, which I mentioned, did identify several interconnected challenges. Firstly, persistent inequalities in science, technology, innovation capacity continue to hold many countries back from full participation in global scientific discourse, which then, of course, tends to skew the direction of scientific diplomacy. The governance of emerging technologies still remains fragmented, which has the risk and has already seen the deepening of inequalities and limiting of equitable access, and cooperative mechanism to manage our global commons, such as shared water basins to the high seas or to outer space, are being put under increasing strain with the pullback from multilateralisms. And we can see these tensions play out in real time. We see research collaborations being strained by export controls and security concerns. We see international students and scholars facing increasing mobility restrictions. We see scientific data sharing hampered by fears of economic or strategic disadvantage. And we see climate negotiations deadlocked, despite overwhelming scientific consensus on the urgency of action. Now, I don't want to be too pessimistic, because we also have powerful examples of how science diplomacy can deliver results. For example, the Montreal Protocol, which does remain a very strong example of science diplomacy in action, where scientific evidence of ozone depletion guided global consensus. And today, the ozone layer is healing because 197 countries chose cooperation over competition and evidence over ideology. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, continues to demonstrate how thousands of scientists from diverse nations can produce consensus assessments to inform policy worldwide. And that shows that scientific truth can emerge from collaborative effort across political divides. Another one, the Human Genome Project succeeded because scientists worldwide agreed to share data openly, accelerating discoveries that are now benefiting medical research globally. And of course, there are others I could list. Today, we are at a frontier of emerging technologies that perhaps demand science diplomacy as much, not more than others. These emerging technologies will test our commitment to science diplomacy. And UNESCO has been at the forefront of some of these technologies to develop ethical guardrails and discussions. Artificial intelligence is already reshaping economies, governance, and security. In 2019, UNESCO's 193 member states adopted a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which provided the first global framework for ensuring AI development respects human rights, promotes inclusion, and protects human dignity. Now, today, 6 years later, the framework is no longer aspirationally, it's being translated, its principles are being translated into multilateral normative work is needed to shape real-world governance. Another new area, the area of neurotechnology, linking human minds and machines, which is not completely new, but which has been transformed through the development of artificial intelligence, could revolutionize healthcare, could revolutionize education and communication. Investment in neurotech companies grew by more than 700% between 2014 and 2021. But neurotechnology also raises profound questions. Who owns our neural data? How do we protect our own mental privacy within and across borders? How do we ensure that these tools are used to heal and help people rather than manipulate people? So just last week, during the 43rd session of the UNESCO General Conference, member states adopted also the first global normative stand of its kind on the ethics of neurotechnology. This landmark recommendation will help governments discuss, ensure that neurotechnology innovation remains ethical, inclusive, and human-centered. The year 2025 has also been proclaimed by the UN General Assembly as the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology. We know from this new emerging science, quantum technologies that can promise to transform how we address our greatest challenges, from developing new materials, for clean energy storage, to creating ultra-precise sensors for climate monitoring, to revolutionizing drug discovery, to securing global communications. So what is distinctive about this multilateral approach for the United Nations system is the grounding of science in human rights. The insistence that ethical frameworks must be developed inclusively, not imposed by technical leaders on the rest of the world, but co-created through general dialogue among nations. And this is science diplomacy in its truest form, ensuring that those who will be affected by technological change have a voice in shaping how it unfolds. And of course, science technology is most powerful when these global principles meet local realities. And I think some of the work of the United Nations in Sri Lanka is a good it demonstrates this translation in action. I'll mention a few, mainly from UNESCO, because I know UNESCO's work better. We have a UNESCO Category 2 Center for Water Management in Peradeniya, which doesn't just serve Sri Lanka, but supports regional research across South Asia on equitable water access. This is addressing one of the most contentious resource challenges in this region and beyond. As we know, water scarcity is something that can fuel conflict. Sri Lankan scientists contribute to the tsunami early warning systems that protect coastal communities across the entire Indian Ocean basin. A vital example of science for diplomacy, where shared vulnerability creates commitment to cooperation. And after the devastating 2004 tsunami, the Intergovernmental Ocean Commission of UNESCO helped establish this Indian Ocean tsunami warning and mitigation system, turning a tragedy into a catalyst for lasting scientific cooperation. And Sri Lanka's biosphere reserves under the Manna Biosphere Program of UNESCO serve as living laboratories, demonstrating to the world how biodiversity conservation and community livelihoods can thrive together. These sites are part of a global network of 759 biosphere reserves in 136 countries, a diplomatic network built not on treaties, but on shared commitment to sustainable development. UNEP has a World Restoration Flagship Program. Mangrove Regeneration Initiative positions Sri Lanka as a knowledge hub for coastal restoration, and Sri Lanka is sharing lessons with other nations facing similar challenges. But beyond institution, it is people who really embody science diplomacy in action. The Shilpa Sayurara Foundation Next Gen Girls in Technology Program, which was recognized with the UNESCO Prize for Girls and Women's Education, has empowered more than 1,000 young women in rural communities to master coding, the Internet of Things, and machine learning. When a young woman in rural Sri Lanka learns to code and solve local problems with technology, she becomes part of a global community innovator. She can contribute to open source projects, collaborate with researchers well. I think we have a somebody's mic. Sorry, I'm hearing somebody else speak, if that could be. Thank you.
Oh,
so this is. Sorry, I think we have. I don't know if the moderators could cut the other person.
Other voice?
Is some. Thank you.
Kapital light की का क्या मुझे
I think operates at the grassroots level, not just government to government, but people to people. So as we look forward, I think we have an important mission to bridge the gap between evidence and policy, between research and action, and between science and society. So maybe we can end now with 3 tangible commitments that we can make here in Sri Lanka and across the UN system. The first being to researchers and scientists. When you share your data freely, when you publish in accessible formats and collaborate across borders, you are practicing science diplomacy. And your work is not complete just when it is published. Your work is complete when it serves humanity. Second, to policy and diplomats. Invest in science education and infrastructure as you would in any critical national asset, because it is one. Champion the international frameworks that UNESCO and other UN agencies develop to make emerging technologies accessible and ethical. Create visa policies that enable scientific mobility. Fund participation in international research projects. Recognize that science diplomacy isn't a cost. It's an investment in your nation's capacity to navigate an uncertain future. And third, I think for all of us to hear, we all need to become ambassadors of this diplomacy of truth, countering disinformation not with silence, but with patient, evidence-based explanation built on clear communication. We need to build bridges between scientific communities and the public. We need to translate complexity into clarity without sacrificing accuracy. We need to support scientific journalism. We need to demand that political leaders respect scientific evidence, even when it's inconvenient. And we need to teach young people not just scientific facts, but scientific thinking. Skepticism tempered by evidence, curiosity balanced by rigor. So I would argue that we stand at a crossroad at this moment. One path leads to a fragmented world where scientific knowledge becomes another arena for geopolitical competition, where breakthrough technologies benefit only the wealthy and the powerful, and where distrust science undermines our collective ability to address existential threats. The other path, which is still open to us, is a world where science diplomacy rebuilds the foundations of international cooperation, where evidence guides decision-making, where technological advancement serves all of humanity, and where the next generation inherits not just our problems, but our commitment to solving them together. We have that choice, but we don't have much time. So I would plead that we reaffirm that trust in science is ultimately trust in our shared ability to build a more sustainable and peaceful world, one where innovation serves humanity rather than the other way around, and where no one is left behind. So in this age of disinformation and division, let us embrace this new diplomacy of truth, where science guides, where dialogue unites and knowledge becomes a common language for peace. The triple planetary crisis demands it, emerging technologies require it, and future generations deserve it. UNESCO, of course, with all the other UN agencies, are here and ready to support this, and we look forward to continuing to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Curtis. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Dr. Sirumali Fernando. Dr. Sirumali Fernando is a distinguished scientist and policy leader and a fellow of the International Science Council, the National Academy of Sciences, Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lanka College of Microbiologists. With over 35 years in academia, including 22 years as Professor of Microbiology at the University of Sri Javardhanapura, she has been a driving force in advancing Sri Lanka's science and innovation landscape. She has served as the chairperson of the National Science Foundation, science advisor to the Minister of Science and Technology, and Secretary General of the Sri Lanka National Commission for UNESCO. A founding member of the ISC Governing Board, she has also contributed to UNESCAP, CSAN, and INSA. Dr. Fernando spearheaded major national initiatives such as Lintec, COSTI, and the National STI Strategy, leaving a lasting impact on science and policy in Sri Lanka. Dr. Fernando will now speak on the role of science diplomacy in national R&D, a Sri Lankan perspective. Over to you, madam.
Yes, to get to the screen. Sorry about that. Good afternoon to all of you, and let me first of all congratulate the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Foreign Ministry for this initiative, which is very timely, and also thank you, the organizing committee, for inviting me to speak a few words on role of science diplomacy in national R&D. May I have the first slide, please? Right, so anyway, science diplomacy, as you heard, has tremendous impact on humanity. And over the years, it has contributed to, as you know, the smallpox eradication. You heard about the Montreal Protocol. It really fixed the sky for us, the ozone layer. And it was very critical in controlling COVID-19 and establishing the Indian Ocean tsunami warning system. And I'm very proud to say that one of our own scientists, this is Professor Samantha Hettiarachchi, led that team to Professor. Professor Samantha Hettiarachchi really led the entire technical team to establish the tsunami warning system. And also, as Dr. Tim Curtis pointed out, today we have global consensus on safe and ethical use of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, thanks to science diplomacy. So that also, I mean, that's not the end of the story. We do have so many global challenges. You have heard of all these challenges, and through the SDGs, again, through science diplomacy channels, the world is trying to address all these challenges. I don't want to go too much into this, but of course the pandemic preparedness is now a key. We know what happened with COVID-19, climate adaptation, energy transitions, ocean governance, biodiversity, challenges with emerging tech. Any emerging technology will now pose challenges, and we have the mechanisms, and thanks to UNESCO, which takes lead there in making sure that whatever the new technologies that we are facing or we are using, will be safe and ethical. So there's now instruments for biotech, artificial intelligence and data, nuclear technologies, quantum and neurotechnologies. These are all instruments that are going to help the scientists in years to come.
පෙන් එක තියෙනවද මේක ගන්නද මම චුට්ටක් අර ප්‍රසන්ටේෂන් එක ඇතුලේ පොඩි පේන්නේ නැහැ පෙන් එක ආයි ගෙවුවන ගන්න
So the lineup is I have been asked to talk about the role of science diplomacy in R&D, and my focus would be more on R&D. And what I'm planning to do is to compare the current global status of R&D and then see where we are and how we can best use science diplomacy to build our capacity. So it's very Sri Lanka oriented, and that's why it's the Sri Lankan perspective. So if you look at the global research landscape, well, it's, you could see that in the first column, I'm looking at the various indices of science and technology, and then I'll be comparing these indices with Global South and Global North. Global North are the countries, the OECD countries, that's particularly US, the EU, and the Australasia countries. Global South are low and middle countries like ours. So these data are mainly from 2022. That year, the world spent $3 trillion for R&D. And of that, 2/3 was spent by the high-income countries. If we look at the global research pool, it's about 8.5 million researchers, full-time equivalent. And again, 2/3 or more are in the high-income countries. Publications in the scientists here would know what SCI journals are. Those are Science Citation Index journals. In 2019, there were 3.3 million papers published. And again, 2/3 came from the high-income countries. Patent applications, again, 3.6 million. The most, you can see the countries in the global north or high-income countries, they tend to file more in the US Patent Office. USPTO is a US Patent Office. And in the countries in the south have less filings in USPTO, about 25 to 30%. In the PCT, that's the WIPO lined patent filing system. Well, the global north would have filed about 55 to 60% of the patents compared to 40 to 45% in the PCT WIPO system. Now, India and China, which are considered countries in the global south, they tend to file their patents in the PCT system, and that's why that figure is fairly high. Now, this very large research infrastructure is a definition given by the OECD for their really huge infrastructure. World over, there's estimated to be about 30 to 50 such infrastructures. The number varies depending on how people interpret this definition. But again, over 90% of this infrastructure is located in the high-income countries. So obviously, there's a very uneven terrain when it comes to global research. the high-income countries, their GDPs are high, and they can invest heavily on research programs, infrastructure, and even on personnel. Whereas the global south countries, the financial resources are very limited, high debt burdens, competing developmental priorities, and therefore making large-scale investment for R&D is quite challenging. And that's what's happening to Sri Lanka today. So if you look at what opportunities are there for us in the global arena for research and development, yes, there are a lot of research partnerships happening across the globe. When you say partnerships, they are in many different types. They may be treaty-based intergovernmental partnerships, or they may be just networked hubs and affiliations to access facilities, training like ICGB, ICTP affiliated centers, or they may be open data federations or research consortia. But when you look at how these partnerships, the dynamics of these partnerships, in 2010, those I'm sorry, I thought this was going on. Right, anyway, in 2010, the partnerships were mainly among North-North countries. But as we move on to 2025, we tend to see more North-South partnerships, which is a good sign for Sri Lanka, because that shows that we have more opportunity for link up with countries with better research systems. And this is something we could look at in time to come and develop our own programs to link up with global programs. So I'm sorry, I can't show you what's there, but anyway, there are so many global consortia for research. Human Genome Project was mentioned. Now it's completed. It's one of a very success story of science diplomacy. Now equally another program, Earth Biogenome Project, has been started. And I'm happy to say Sri Lanka would also partner with this program very soon through the SLIPTech. I think they have signed the MOU to partner with the Earth Biogenome Project. For climate change, climate and earth system science, there are several programs: health, physics and space, ocean and polar sciences. So in so many different domains, we get about, it's estimated that there are about 500, close to 500 research consortia across the globe. Whew.
Since the presentation is not visible here, we can connect it from there and you can see it from here and say the next slide, then we can switch it on. Is it okay? Next slide ke बाद slide mark on tagga.
Okay, so here we are. So this slide is about, we are looking at the opportunities for us to work with the global research system. So, well, as Dr. Tim pointed out, UNESCO is the only, I would say, UN agency with a very clear, specific mandate for science. And UNESCO has several UNESCO centers. We are talking about infrastructure that is available for countries like ours to go and make use of or develop partnerships with. So UNESCO has different types of centers. Category 1 centers are centers that are fully funded and supported by UNESCO. And there's one category 1 center, most of you would have heard of it, the ICTP, International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, Italy. And in addition, there are about 98 UNESCO Category 2 centers over 95 countries. Well, Tim said that we have one Category 2 center in Peradeniya. And also we have the Majamjit Singh Research, UNESCO affiliated research center in University of Moratuwa. Professor Lalit is heading that. So we have some international presence here as well, where we support other countries with their scientific requirements. Now on the other side, you see the ICGB. Again, ICGB was started by UNIDO, and now it's a fully independent organization, and it has 65 countries as members. They have a very sophisticated laboratory system for molecular biology and biotechnology. They have 3 main laboratory complexes. The main one is in Trieste, Italy, and then they also have a very large research facility in New Delhi, and the third one is in Cape Town, South Africa. In addition, over the past 3 years, they have started to recognize regional research centers of the ICGB. They have one very, very huge center in China. And I'm very proud to say that we have one in Sri Lanka, that's SLIPTech. And the third ICGB RRC is in Kenya. So in addition to that, may I have the next slide, please? Oh, these are the very large research infrastructure that we have been hearing about. CERN is well known. That's the European Organization for Nuclear Research, or CERN. It's huge. It's mainly a European consortium that is supporting that and governing that. It's funded by mainly by the government of Germany and Switzerland. I think although it's located in Geneva, it's supported more by the German government. Its annual membership is about, well, India, just as an associate member, pays about 16 million Swiss francs a year. So that's huge. They are just beyond us. But fortunately, thanks to science diplomacy, when Mr. Ravinath Arya Singha was the ambassador, we managed to arrange a cooperative agreement with CERN in 2017. And as a result, our scientists can go and work with scientists there. And also we have had exchange programs with CERN for students and teachers. So these are possible. It's for us to really proactively look at what is available and how we can get the maximum out of these. So again, the Synchrone, the Sesame was mentioned, a very unique story of, I think, 7 Middle Eastern countries came together with the Israel, Palestine, Iran, all together to set this up. And it's a beautiful story of science diplomacy based in Jordan, I think. Then the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, again, 5 countries have dumped a lot of funds into setting it up. This is for fusion technologies. And well, it's yet to start operations. I'm sure you have heard of the International Space Research Station. Again, it's mainly governed and funded by 5 main countries. May I have the next slide, please? So just to quickly go through what science diplomacy is. We did hear about science diplomacy, what it means. Next slide. So in 2010, this is the definition we had. This was really, the definition was introduced jointly by the Royal Society of the UK and AAAS. And that was diplomacy for science, science for diplomacy, science in diplomacy. That was the general understanding. But this year, February, they came up with a new definition where it says diplomatic endeavor with scientific program and scientific programs driven by diplomacy. So just 2 categories that fall into science diplomacy. Next slide, please. So yeah, basically, now the tendency is earlier, even if a scientist starts an international cooperation, that was identified as science diplomacy. But now it's getting clearer. Only when the governments are involved, you call it science diplomacy, and that's what this is all about. So now let's go into look at role of science diplomacy in national R&D. So we looked at how the global landscape for R&D. We looked at the data. May I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so now let's try to see where we are in this whole global scenario. You can see the same indices and how the world is faring, how the global south, which is close to your part of that, is faring, and where we are as Sri Lanka. So if you look at the gross expenditure on research and development, the main index that we really look at for research, generally the world has been spending about 2% of the GDP on research. And when you say 2%, that varies in high-income countries, even up to 5%. In countries like Israel, South Korea, it's from 4 to 5% of their GDP is spent on research. But Sri Lanka, and then even the global south, mainly because of India and China, the figure still remains at 2% of the GDP. But look at Sri Lanka, where we are. It's just 0.1% of the GDP, which is grossly inadequate. And that means our capacity, our resources are very limited. So if you look at the number of researchers, I'll just focus on the researchers per million, because that will allow us to compare. Now in the world, there are about 1,420 researchers per million population. In the global south, this figure is about 500. I'm just giving approximate figures, right? about 500 researchers per million people. Sri Lanka, this is very low, okay? 97 per million population, extremely low, because our total head count is about 6,270. This was in 2022. And our full-time equivalent, which the world considers for these statistics, is 2,150. So it's very low, and this is something this is nothing new. We have been seeing this for the past 2 decades. We have been trying to address it, but because of the low investment, it's difficult to retain, because we can't pay the salaries they deserve, a lot of issues, and therefore our researcher numbers are extremely low. And this is reflected in our publications. But what I would, again, in the publications, what I would like you all to notice here is that of the publications that were in SCI journals, 70% of our publications were with foreign co-authors, showing our dependence on the foreign systems for our output. We may be having the best researchers, very good researchers, but we are so dependent on overseas systems for our publications also. May I have the next slide, please? So, what can science diplomacy do for us as regards to the R&D system? Yes, of course, they can help. We can have better partnerships for better science. We can access more resources, more infrastructure, funding, and opportunities are there. But we can also use that. I think this is what we should be doing for capacity building to train more researchers. And with this, and adopting the best practices from the established laboratories, we can improve our visibility and credibility in research. And with that, we can go for more and more scientific cooperation, and we could keep this cycle continuing. Next slide, please. So what we need to realize is that we can't just with very little resources, we can ask for partnerships. It's not easy. And particularly from a science diplomacy point of view, it's like we wanting to have a joint venture with, I'm not trying to look down upon anyone, but with a beggar. No one would want to do that, because that is, and in fact, I have served as chairperson of NSF for 12 years. This is one of the main obstacles, challenges I faced during that time when I wanted to develop MOUs with other funding organizations. I mean, they have the German Research Foundation just told me, Sirimali, this is our budget, this is your budget. Now, how can I convince my board that we should collaborate? I mean, I didn't know what to say. I mean, this is how, it boils down to dollars and cents. So let's accept it. And therefore, unless we make a conscious effort to invest and improve our research system, although how much we try getting the kind of partnerships we want at international level, will still remain a dream. So we need to go for better infrastructure. We need to have more thematic research consortia that would match with international research consortia. International best practices, we don't need money to do that. to adopt on research integrity, ethics, and safety, and so on. There are good laboratory practices standards we could adopt these so that we could improve our systems to some level. Talent development and mobility is essential. We need to have a very clear strategy to do that. Data governance. We don't have a system of open data sharing or data policy. These have to be established. And of course, the funding and support systems. Right. So that's from the Ministry of Science, would have to take the lead in that. And I think we need to have an institutionalized system for science diplomacy. So unless right now what happens is a scientist would go and they work with other scientists, they have a project to collaborate, we go for an MOU, we work out the whole MOU, then send it, and we have to wait 1 year to get the approval for that MOU. So we need a system that is much more efficient than this. And this is where I think the Foreign Ministry can take the lead to really create that in partnership with Ministry of Science and Technology to institutionalize a national, maybe a science diplomacy council, or at least a committee to begin with. We have also been asking to post science attaches in key missions abroad. It hasn't happened, but on individual interest, I should say, some ambassadors and high commissioners have helped us a lot. We should also, I propose that we should have a one-stop national contact point to expedite foreign or international partnerships. Particularly, it's getting the MOUs approved or even documents, because any delay on our part affects the credibility of our researchers. So we have to make sure that credibility is maintained and supported. Create rapid response mechanisms and funding, and train. We have to train people for R&D, not only for that, but in science diplomacy. Again, not just scientists, but the diplomats also should be trained in science diplomacy. So, lastly, I just want to mention 2 groups that we should not forget in any institutionalization arrangement of science diplomacy. We need to recognize the contribution of the corporate sector in R&D in this country. Although our investments are low, we should be happy that 40% of our R&D expenditure comes from the private sector. That has to be recognized and promoted. So they should be supported to get their technologies transferred and whatever, and their research. There are several companies that invest in research. They should be supported. And also, as I think Professor Zakri said, we need to count on our science diaspora. We have a huge resource outside. I know NSF is already doing something, but that's not enough. We have to have incentive schemes. We have to make sure that they are recognized in a proper way so that they could become part of our research system. So with that, I will wind up. Next one. Wishing you all a happy World Science Day, and finish it with the founding principle of UNESCO, which says, and I quote, "Since wars begin in the minds of women and men, it is in the minds of women and men that the defenses of peace must be constructed." Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Fernando, for your reflections on how science diplomacy can elevate national research and innovation capacity. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will enjoy a short cultural performance showcasing the creativity and spirit that reflect the harmony between art, science, and culture.
ලස්සන කුසුමා සන බැඳ කිරි ඕන එක් කරවා පාස නලු මුර දීප සූප දක්වමිනේ පුද ගෙන මාල් පුල තින ලක්නේ සුමන දේවි වටිනේ ගිනි ඕන
Thank you for that wonderful performance. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Professor Marcelo Nobel. Professor Nobel is the Executive Director of the World Academy of Sciences, TWAS, leading its mission to advance science in developing countries since December 2024. A physicist, a former rector of the UNICAMP, he is known for his strong advocacy of education, scientific progress, and democracy. During his tenure as rector, he established initiatives promoting inclusion and human rights, including the Refugees Cathedral and the Executive Directorship of Human Rights. At UNICAMP, where he served for over 26 years, he earned his bachelor's and PhD degrees in physics and later conducted postdoctoral research in Europe. Professor Nobel has also held key leadership positions such as Vice President of the Brazilian Physics Society and Executive Director of the Brazilian Nanotechnology National Laboratory. He is a researcher and a science communicator with over 300 publications. He has received several national awards, including the 2019 Jose Reyes Prize for Science Popularization and the 2022 CBMM Prize in Science and Technology. Professor Nobel will now speak on the impact of science diplomacy in gathering information to support informed decision making. Over to you, Professor Nobel.
very much for this kind of introduction. It has been a pleasure to participate here in this interesting venue. I would like to complete and maybe even comment on some of the previous talks that I have been watching during this morning here in Trieste, Italy, where I am, and of course in the afternoon for you. It's indeed a distinct honor to have been invited to address these few words to a distinguished audience. I really wish I were there with you in Colombo. On behalf of the World Academy of Sciences, or TWAS, I extend my sincerest gratitude to the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka for their kind invitation and for organizing this timely and crucial workshop. The topic before us, the role of diplomacy in informed decision-making in an era of science policy interface, is not just an academic discussion. It's a global imperative. In an era defined by unprecedented global challenges, as already mentioned by my previous speakers, from the escalating climate crisis and the persistent threats of pandemics to the complex issues of food security and digital transformation. The need for robust, evidence-based policy has never been more urgent. Science diplomacy provides the essential bridge between the world of scientific discovery and the realm of policy action. For over 4 decades, TWAS has been a steadfast voice for science in the developing world. Founded in 1983 by a distinguished group of scientists from the Global South and North, led by the Nobel laureate Abdul Salam, our mission is to advance science and engineering for sustainable prosperity in developing countries. We believe that science is a universal language, a powerful tool that transcends political, cultural, and economic divides. It is with this belief that we place science diplomacy at the very core of our identity. Science diplomacy, in its essence, is about building bridges. It's about using the collaborative, evidence-based nature of scientific inquiry to foster trust, address shared challenges, and build a more peaceful and prosperous world. It operates on 3 fundamental dimensions: science in diplomacy, where scientific evidence informs foreign policy; science and diplomacy for science, which facilitates international scientific cooperation; and science for diplomacy, where scientific collaboration helps improve relations between nations. This was already mentioned by other speakers, and I would like to show some specific examples. At TWAS, we see this not as a new trend, but as a fundamental component of our work. We facilitate this by connecting scientists and institutions, funding research, providing fellowships, and creating platforms for dialogue. One of our most successful and impactful initiatives is in the domain of establishment, for example, of the CAS-TWAS Centers of Excellence, a remarkable partnership with the Chinese Academy of Science, CAS. This network of centers embodies the spirit of South-South cooperation, creating world-class hubs of scientific research and training within the developing world for the developing world. These 6 centers, hosted at leading CAS institutes in Beijing, represent a powerful model of South-South cooperation. They provide world-class training and research opportunities for scientists from across the developing world in critical fields like biotechnology, green technology, and climate change. This is more than just a scientific training. It's the creation of a global network of researchers who share a common language of discovery and commitment to solving global problems. They are living laboratories where collaboration flourishes and where solutions to some of the most pressing challenges of our time are being developed. And there is no better illustration than the work of the CAS-TOAS Center of Excellence for Water and Environment, CIWI, hosted by the renewed Research Center for Eco-Environmental Sciences, or RCEES. In Sri Lanka, we have a perfect and inspired example of what we call the triangular science diplomacy in action. This model demonstrates how multiple partners can come together, each bringing their unique strengths to create a solution that is greater than the sum of its parts. For years, just to mention this example, communities in Sri Lanka have grappled with this devastating health impact of the chronic kidney disease, or of unknown etiology, or CKDU, as it's known, a challenge directly linked to water quality. Through the CIWI platform, a powerful collaboration was forged. The Chinese Academy of Science, through RCEES, brought cutting-edge water purification technologies and invaluable scientific expertise. TOAS provided the framework for international cooperation, facilitating the partnership and supporting capacity building. And Sri Lanka, with its dedicated scientists and institutions, became the crucial partner, rounding the project in local needs and realities. This partnership, again, just to mention one example, delivered tangible results. As mentioned, it will have established a joint China-Sri Lanka Research and Demonstration Center for Water Technology, RISE, in Sri Lanka at the University of Peradeniya. It has developed affordable, effective water purification plants in affected communities, providing safe drinking water to thousands. It has trained dozens of Sri Lankan students as researchers, building new generation of local experts. This is not just a project. It is a sustainable ecosystem of innovation and cooperation. It is China, TOAS, and Sri Lanka working hand in hand to solve a critical national challenge, creating a model that can be shared and adopted also across the global south. This is science diplomacy at its best, practical, impactful, and life-changing. It shows that when we combine scientific excellence with diplomatic vision, we can overcome the most daunting challenges. TOAS has been pleased to collaborate also with CAS on the establishment of the CAS-TOAS Network for Sustainable Development. A key initiative has been to launch in 2025 a new program of collaborative grants with the CAS-TOAS Centers of Excellence. The first series of grants offered as a result of the 2025 selection will start in 2026 and will pave the way for more interdisciplinary projects. Building these bridges requires more than just institutions and technology. It requires people. It requires individuals who can navigate the complex worlds of both science and policy. This is why TOAS, in partnership with the American Association of the Advancement of Science, AAAS, has been running a flagship course on science diplomacy for over a decade. This program is designed to cultivate a new generation of leaders who are fluent in the languages of both science and diplomacy, and who can act as catalysts for evidence-based policymaking. These intensive programs brings together early career scientists and policymakers from developing countries, equipping them with the skills and the network to become effective science diplomats. They learn to negotiate, to communicate complex evidence for non-specialists, and to build consensus around shared challenges. And so, it gives me immense pleasure to recognize that the key organizers and moderators of this very workshop, Sayed Shami and Nipshi Fernando, are proud alumnus of this year's AAS TWAS Science Diplomacy course. Their participation and now their leadership here today is a testament of the program impact and to Sri Lanka's commitment to fostering this critical expertise. We are incredibly proud to see our alumni like them become agents of change in their home countries and regions. They are the living embodiment of our mission, and they are the future of science diplomacy. Mr. Shami and Mrs. Fernando are one of more than 100 Sri Lankans who have benefited from TWAS programs. This includes 67 recipients of TWAS research grants, 16 scholars supported through the South-South TWAS postgraduate partnerships, and 3 participants in the TWAS UNESCO Associateship Program. We have also welcomed 14 Sri Lankan participants to our science diplomacy activities, and Sri Lanka is represented in our scientific community by 6 TWAS Young Affiliates and 6 TWAS Fellows, further testaments of the country's growing contribution to global science. In closing, the challenges we face, from climate change to public health, from food security to water scarcity, are immense. No single nation can solve them alone, as already mentioned. But by working together, by placing science at the heart of our diplomatic efforts, we can forge a path towards a more sustainable and equitable future. Sri Lanka, with its rich scientific heritage and its strategic location, is poised to play a leading role in the advancement of science diplomacy in the region and beyond. TWAS stands ready to deepen our partnership with the scientific community and the government of Sri Lanka. We are eager to explore new avenues for collaboration, to support your young scientists, and to help build the institutional structures needed to ensure that policy is always informed by the best available evidence. Let us work together to build a future where science and diplomacy are not separate endeavors, but 2 sides of the same coin, working in concert to create a better world for all. The work you are doing here today is absolutely fundamental for a prosperous world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Nobel. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will have a short tea break. And please be back by 4:15 when we will begin our panel discussion with both on-site and online participants. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated for us to start the panel discussion.
Check work.
Okay, and
Check.
May I first invite our on-site panelists to the head table. Dr. Sirimali Fernando, former chairman of NSF, former Secretary General, Sri Lanka National Commission for UNESCO. Mr. Samantha Pathirana, Director General, South Asia Division, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Employment and Tourism, Sri Lanka. Professor Lalit Rajpaksha, Director, UNESCO Water Centre and Centre Chairman, UNESCO Mandanjit Singh Centre for South Asia Water Management. And I now invite distinguished panelists, Professor Marcelo Nobel, Executive Director of UNESCO Tours, the World Academy of Sciences, Italy, and Dr. Peter McGrath, Coordinator of IAP Trieste, Italy. Professor Tan Sri Dr. Zakir Abdul Hamid was supposed to join the panel discussion. However, he will not be able to join the discussion. To moderate this important discussion, I now invite Mr. Said Shami, member of the International Network for Governmental Science Advice, AAAS Tours Science Diplomacy Alumni, UNU CRIS Modern Diplomacy Alumni, and fellow RSS UK. Over to you.
Thank you, Nimshi. We're happy to hear that there are nearly 200 online participants there, and we're thankful for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for inviting these participants from foreign missions in abroad. And so there's one special guest here, so I would like to invite him for the panel, Dr. Benjin Luo, the Director of the National Innovation Center for Excellence, China. And today discussions and our objective is to familiarize this term in science diplomacy, and we want to make some awareness about this science diplomacy and how we going to work way forward to ignite this term, this science diplomacy, how it's going to work. And based on this, our discussion will focus on untapped potential of soft power and cooperation to enhance scientific partnerships for national development goals. Thank you very much. And first of all, our two panelists are there in online. Dr. Marcelo Nobel from Trieste, Italy, from the UNESCO TW Towers, and so I would like to invite for the panel online as Dr. Peter McGrath also. This is a coordinator of the Inter-Academy Partnership in Trieste, Italy. Thank you, Dr. Peter and Dr. Marcelo, for joining online, and also our panelists here in person to joining this event. And so that this term, then we learn from this, our presentations from these international local experts, that how it's work in universal goals, how the countries set their diplomacy, and in line with national priorities to achieve the mutual benefits within their national framework of the priorities. First, I would like to ask from Professor Dr. Peter, and so I think could you like to hear from you, and how can the countries institutionalizing this science diplomacy and the process to ensure the evidence-based insight consistently influence the national and regional policy decisions within the science diplomacy framework.
Okay, thank you, Shami, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. I should add maybe just that I'm not only the coordinator of IAP, the Inter-Academy Partnership here in Trieste, but also the TWAS Science Diplomacy Program. So a little of what you've heard from Professor Knobel about the 10 years of courses with AAAS and TWAS. This is also something I've been largely responsible for. So that brings me my experience with science diplomacy. In answer to your question, how can countries institutionalize science advice mechanisms? I think we've heard some of the solutions already from Dr. Fernando earlier before the tea break, especially with the in the Sri Lankan context. There's a possibility to learn from different countries, to understand what they are doing in their contexts. But I think it's very important to set up the whole ecosystem, if you like, perhaps starting at the top with a science advisor to the Prime Minister or the President, a science advisor in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and those two would obviously work very closely together. Maybe with others, in the Department of Science, Higher Education, the Department of Industry, Department of Health, whichever can be critical. The issue of science attaches has been raised, so having those focal points in the different embassies outside of Sri Lanka or whichever country, but also drawing down on the expertise of the scientific community in the country is important too. I think I understand you had a session this morning your time involving the Academy and the National Academy of Science of Sri Lanka, also talking about institutionalizing science advice mechanisms. I think there's a lot to be learned from the studies that they have undertaken. And then engaging with, I won't say every scientist in the country, but we heard the call for more scientists, especially from Professor Zachary, to get involved in science policy and creating the environment where those scientists' voices, their advice and recommendations can be heard, can be collated and synthesized to feed up into the government decision-making processes. I think this is a way that we can ensure that the decisions being made by the policymakers are the most rational based on the scientific evidence that is available. Thank you.
Peter, and just yes, we learned from today morning and even from Dr. Fernando's presentations about this institutionalizing this mechanism in science, how the international evidences and international experiences. In particular, this I would like to ask you again that if I ask in this way, I'm asking from your experience in the global experience, how Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Science and Technology and national professional academies could work together to bring it this formal process on this science diplomacy, or just say that's I mean for the institutionalized diplomacy.
Okay, well, I think different countries have different mechanisms, different histories, different ways of doing things. So in the case of Sri Lanka, I would say you need to figure out yourselves the most effective structure. there are often, I'm not finger pointing here, but there are often silos between government ministries. You know, each one is responsible for its own area and they don't necessarily communicate one with the other. One example that often comes up is the example of One Health, which, if you're not familiar with it, it takes into account human health, animal health, and environmental health. But obviously, these different sectors are often covered by the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture, for example, for animal health, and the Ministry of Environment for the environmental health. And this is perhaps why the issue of One Health has not progressed in many countries as much as it might have done. And it's a question of breaking down those silos, understanding that, you know, science diplomacy is a collaboration. It's about building relations, sharing information, and, you know, working towards finding a process that will work in Sri Lanka. There is no sort of one answer for every different country here. So it's what you find will work best in your national environment, I think.
Thank you, Peter. I think that's we can move the floor to the Professor Dr. Sirimeni Fernando. I think when we talk about the national framework or the national perspectives, so how can our policies, I'm generally asking the policies, can frameworks be reoriented to ensure the sustainability become a core drive of research funding and agenda setting? I'm asking the global science partnerships to do within the science, in the global science partnerships, or who want to make some global science and technology partnerships and the collaborations. How can our policy frames to be reorientated to ensure the sustainability to becomes a core drive for R&D funding and agenda setting for the global partnerships?
Thank you, Shami. Yeah, well, whether we have to reorient it or whether we just need to implement what is there is something we need to decide. Because our policy strategies, they all focus on international cooperation, right? And if you look at the 2010-2015 strategy for STI, there's a whole section on international cooperation, and most of what was mentioned by me today is there. So that was done, I think, about 10 years ago, and we haven't been able to really implement those for several reasons. But I think the sense is we need to believe in that. And we have to commit for that. And commitment is funding commitment. There was a time that to support this, we also introduced various funding instruments for international collaborations at NSF. But then unfortunately, maybe because of economic crisis, whatever, now they're on hold. So it's not a matter of that they're not in policies, but it's a matter of implementing what is already, what we have planned. But now with the changing global scenario, we can improve on that, because we can improve on the need for our, to train our science personnel, particularly in very specialized areas. And those can be identified, and this is where science diplomacy can really play a role. And we have programs to train for postgraduate studies and for short courses. Every year, the External Resources Department, they get invitations for various training programs. But I think here we need a very specialized focus on areas we need to focus on. For instance, we don't have enough data scientists, then we need to focus on that, right? We don't have the capacity, the sufficient capacity for evidence synthesis. Let's focus on that. Maybe there are short-term trainings, but that is where we need to be now strategic. And there should be a way of assessing our skill requirement, and then the foreign ministry supporting us to negotiate with respective governments, whatever, or organizations, to find the mechanism to train our people. But you know, what we need to realize is we can't expect everything to happen free. We need to. We should be prepared to invest. This is an investment. Human resource is our biggest resource. So if we don't invest in that, I mean, what are we talking about? So that is where that commitment is essential. So we will have to, you know, change our programs, policies, but we shouldn't forget the fundamental requirements of the country. So I think we can, maybe we could, I mean, even if we implement what is already there, I think we could do something, but of course we can elaborate to identify the, you know, with the change in times, we can identify our priorities and then go for a better training programs or better diplomatic programs in the future.
Mobility.
Yeah, because I mean, I hate to call this brain drain. I don't believe in that. Because whatever goes will bring back something. And if you see in the past what we, So in the past, if you look at our international cooperation in science and technology as a country, what we have achieved most is through what individual scientists have built. It is not something, I mean, we never had big government supported programs for the country, very few if at all. But here, you know, the scientists have, I mean, they proactively, they go and they talk to the people they know, and they bring in collaborations through MOUs, whatever. So I think, you know, that is something that could be now improved. All right? So, and supporting that activity, and again with the diaspora, now what, I don't know about others, but I know I have benefited a lot through our diaspora. A lot of our expatriates have supported. And you know, yes, they went away, but they are now bringing another dimension, another whole heap of support. You know, one person would, I mean, maybe we lost them for a few years, but now they're coming up with a lot of resources. For example, Professor Sivanathan. I mean, the amount of, you know, support he's bringing back is enormous. Dr. Bandula Vijay, they are bringing back a lot. So Professor Ravi, they would take sabbatical and come and work with us. So appreciate what the diaspora is doing, rather than saying that we are losing. No, we don't lose. Let's allow the mobility. And I think the ILO has shown the most mobile group of people in the world are the highly skilled people like researchers. So that has to be encouraged, and that would really help us to build our science. This is my personal opinion.
Thank you, madam. Thank you for insightful thoughts and your sharing this, your knowledge and experience in this area. And I think the next is come for this, the foreign ministry, and madam also they talk about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think to my understanding there are several science projects are going in collaboration through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like this some collaborations also like IORA and some BIMSTEC science and technology innovations, to name a few. And I would like to hear from Mr. Samantha Pathirana that what's your view or what's your experience in the diplomatic missions in facilitating international science collaboration and innovation partnerships?
Thank you, Dr. Shami. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the lead government agency in carrying out the country's foreign relations. So the one main tool in carrying out international relations is diplomacy. So in diplomacy, you find cultural diplomacy, economic diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy, and science diplomacy. So although science diplomacy is, the history of science diplomacy can be traced back to, I think, several centuries, it has now become more prominent and important. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in performing science diplomacy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is one of the main collaborators, one of the main stakeholders. Science and Technology Ministry is one of the key players, and scientific community, academia, then the civil society, all of them, play a role. In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, almost all divisions, back in the headquarters, almost all the divisions contribute to science diplomacy. Maybe some divisions more, like United Nations and Multilateral Affairs Division, which deals with United Nations agencies, and the Economic Affairs Division, and so forth. When it comes to Sri Lankan missions, we have about 63 diplomatic missions and consular posts, and these are powerful instruments in carrying out Sri Lanka's science diplomacy overseas. So they are well placed to, reach out to international scientific communities, initiating science and technology agreements, and reaching out to diaspora scientists, etc. But out of these 63 missions, I think some missions have a bigger role in carrying out science diplomacy, like the missions in New York, in Geneva, in Vienna, in Rome, in Paris, and Nairobi, which deal with multilateral diplomacy with United Nations agencies. And I think Sri Lanka's science diplomacy endeavors work quite well, and we have a talented pool of diplomats coming from various backgrounds. In Sri Lanka, science diplomacy is integrated into the main work program of our missions, and our diplomats multitask, I think a mention was made about science attaches. Just some countries, I think countries with more resources do appoint science attaches, but in Sri Lanka, most of our missions are very small. In some missions, there is only a head of mission and a junior diplomat. So I think with the available limited resources, we do quite well. Of course, there is room for improvement. And also, I think mention was made about the training. Yes, I think some training, some scientific science diplomacy modules can be introduced to diplomatic training. But other than that, I think our system works well. There is room for improvement, and the Foreign Ministry is committed to contribute to Sri Lanka's science diplomacy exercise. Thank you.
Interesting that you mentioned in the last when your discussion that the ministry can introduce these science diplomacy modules to the diplomatic training. To my knowledge, I learned from the diplomatic schools there is a there's a diplomatic training module, only something 1 hour course module is there regarding the introduction of science diplomacy, to my understanding, please correct me. So as a way forward, not a way forward, and in future, could we able to introduce or extend that course to the great extent, let's say for 1-2 credit or something, this science diplomacy, can we, Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Science and Technology jointly work and can introduce with foreign collaborators for the to develop that program, and can we have any possibilities to introduce to the diplomatic training as a part of the diplomatic training?
I believe so. You know, the Bandaranaike Bandaranaike International Diplomatic Training Institute is our training arm. So generally, diplomats, when they are recruited to the foreign service, undergo induction training. I'm sure, you know, there should be possibility to introduce this module for the new diplomats, as well as I think it will be useful to introduce, offer this training to mid-career and senior diplomats as well, you know.
Thank you. That's Yvonne. Thank you very much, and we will see how we could work on that one. And before I go to Professor Rajapaksha, sir, and I would like to hear from our Chinese delegation. Is there from from National Innovation Center for Excellence, NICE in China. I would like to hear that China play the key role in the global diplomacy, also in the science diplomacy, as in the regional diplomacy. And I would like to hear this, what is your experience in linking this science diplomacy or the science to science with global calls on whatever, let's say by SDGs or the Climate Pact, within national priority. That is a very difficult thing, and how we could link this national priority and the global, when it's go to the global collaborations.
Thank you. Thank you for introduction and the question. It's a great pleasure and honor to join this panel. Actually, I come here represent 2 organizations. One is a national organization, one is an international organization. This is a good probably answer to your question. The National Innovation NICE is a National Innovation Center par excellence. This is an ecosystem. The speaker said there is a problem also in China, the silos problem. That means there is one side is the discipline. There is in our ecosystem we call us a comprehensive ecosystem. That means we cover all of the technology areas. That means we have industry, or the manufacturing equipment, environment protection. We have also medicine, biotech. That's also we use our the industrial technology to address probably also agricultural problems. That's all happened in our ecosystem. This is one, that's we connect all the technology areas. The second problem is the separation between the geometrical regions. That means in China, if you go to a province, then there is their own priorities, for example. There is some protection between the provinces. So the NICE, the National Innovation Center par excellence, is responsible for the Yangtze Delta region. These regions comprise Shanghai, and then 3 surrounding provinces. This is a very large areas. That means it covers about 6% of world manufacturing output. It's the manufacturing output is larger than Germany or Japan. But there is also between the province there is some how to say the isolation. We thought from the national perspective that's important to how we connect all the provinces to have large regions, let the innovation factors to flow all around, have more optimizations. This is also what we address in our ecosystem. Then there is another focus in our ecosystem, is the gap between the academia and the industry. There is probably a global challenge. That's academia do some research, do some publish papers, but there is no connection to the industry or the nest. And the industry, especially the private sectors, because they challenge the competence, they cannot spend a lot of money for R&D. That's why this is all cost. So, but the academia doesn't support very good too. That's why we position as a nice position in between. That means we establish so-called joint innovation centers in the leading companies, the private sectors, to cooperate with the industry to know the industry needs. Then we collect all the needs. Then we also collaborate with academia. They are our strategic partners, not only domestic universities, but also international universities. We collect all the industry needs or R&D needs, then go to our academia partners to find solutions. This is one side, so from industry to academia. The other side, because we work so close to with our academia partners, we know what's the focus, research achievements or research results. When we discuss with the professor or the startup teams in the university, is this technology, how far is to the market? Yeah. Then we cooperate with the universities to help them to commercialize their technologies, use our ecosystem. There's also the funds and so on. That is the main tasks in our ecosystem. We have now more than 100 applied technology institutes in our ecosystem. We have also about 200 our own startup high-tech companies in our ecosystem, incubated. That means we have about 18,000 R&D personnel in our United. So this is relatively strong. About the national priorities, very important. You know, China, the focus or in the early time is the development. That means, especially in the Yangtze Delta region, we have so-called the manufacturing hub. We have a lot of factories, and probably they call it the world factories, but it's not sustainable. Since several years ago, the strategy or the national strategy is to focus on sustainability, the digital transformation and the green sustainability and so on. That's why we established our nice ecosystem to have so-called innovation-driven approaches, how to help our industry to go in the direction of the sustainability and the green technology and so on. This is one side. It's about the organization NICE. That's the National Innovation Center. Then the second international organization I represent here is the WITRO, the World Association of Industrial and Technological Organizations. It was founded by United Nations UNIDO in 1970s. It's a global innovation network. That means they had, the WITRO had now about 180 members. This is also organization, research organization across more than 75 countries. NICE is secretary host of the virtual. That is our approach to use our ecosystem to address global challenges through the virtual, because the virtual's mission is to advance the SDGs of UNs. We have some, from NICE perspective, we have our ecosystem to empower the virtual organization. From other side, because there are so many countries, most of them also needs the development the countries, they join the virtual, tend to access the technologies among the member organizations globally. This is very important for us to have our own national private, but at the same time, we go out to have international cooperation to help all the countries to work together to address global challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benjin. I'm linking Dr. Benjin and from that point, and I come to now Professor Lalit Rajapaksha. And sorry, sir, that we know that you are working in UNESCO water management. Am I correct? There are several UNESCO initiatives in globally based in Sri Lanka. So your experience and how can these partnerships among academia and what challenges as a scientist and you face trying to translate the basic research, the technical research into actionable policies, and how it can better communicate to address the diplomacy, so global bridge, in the globally the bridge, how the gap in the bridge.
Yeah, thank you.
The gap.
Thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. At the same time, that is exactly the challenge. So let me put it in this way. So normally when we come to academia or researchers, they operate in a slightly different phase. They operate in a slightly different phase. So if it is a comprehensive research, sometimes it might take years to carry out the investigation and collect data, do the verification, validation, and transfer the results into an applicable form. But when we come to the implementers or the policy side, there is a difference. They work on a different phase. They have sometimes political pressure, sometimes they are working depending on the budget availability, and in addition to that, the communication in between the two groups, academia and the scientists and the policymakers or the implementers. So normally the research findings are published in a slightly different form. They don't go to newspaper articles, they don't go to various other social media directly. These research findings are published in journals or sometimes as model results. So the parties who would need this input for developing their policies or putting it into the actual implementation might miss that message when it is not directly transferred to them. So that is kind of a challenge. But on the other hand, since you referred to the water sector, I am representing the water sector, there are agencies or institutions that give this direction to the relevant parties. They absorb data or information from the scientists, researchers, and then they perform the duty of distributing it to the correct parties at correct time in the correct form. For instance, recently I joined the IHP, the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program Regional Steering Committee meeting. So they set targets for the, let's say now they operate on the strategic plan 9. So they have set a target for 2022 to 2029. Their main target is to guide their member countries to achieve these sustainable development goals by 2030. So in that case, they collect a lot of information from scientific groups, research findings, various other information, and then they pre-process them and distribute them to the relevant parties, the governments, the policymakers. So I think that interface is very important to bridge the gap, as you mentioned, if it is the challenge, converting the research findings into operational stage or the policy making stage. So we have to bridge this gap somehow. It could be a different party operating in the middle, or maybe we have to find a language or a frequency that can be understood by both the groups. So the policymakers should receive the correct information at correct time. Otherwise, even if we do a lot of research, they might not get the required attention when the policies are formulated. And they might go unnoticed when the government or the different agencies want to prepare their plans for the next 5 years or 10 years. So we need to somehow bridge this gap to meet this challenge.
Thank you, Professor. That if I ask in this way, that for your your research and how we use that research to bring the global partnership. I am asking the international partnership. That in that perspective, how you could say a few? Can you say a few words about?
This question, because I don't want to call it as working in silos, but sometimes we have our own restrictions. It could be the funding, it could be the knowledge base, it could be the expertise that we need to focus on some specific areas. So in that case, these international collaborations play a very important role. Of course, we have a very good set of experts here who have gained experience both locally and overseas. But for instance, when it comes to water sector, we can collaborate with various organizations like IHP, the Intergovernmental Hydrologic Program, as I mentioned, who set targets for the next decade. And in addition to that, we have several other organizations like the ICCP, who is working on the climate change predictions and sets guideline for how to reduce carbon footprint emission, and also how to prepare policies for the next few years, targeting achieving those our various commitments to, like we have committed to reduce our carbon footprint, our emissions, and also on top of that we have committed to replace power generation by using renewable sources. So when it comes to the implementation part, we need sometimes input from outside parties who have done additional research, who has implemented these policies and methodologies beforehand, and that is where the international collaborations and also the relationships could play a very important role. And on top of that, I should appreciate that organizations like, if I'm going to name a few, like the JICA, Japanese governmental organization, they have various grant schemes targeting the developing countries to achieve various targets, achieve set targets by the various agreements. For instance, now the Japanese government has extended support to monitor several of our river basins, to monitor their water quality and how to control pollutant discharges to these basins. And sometimes even in Sri Lanka at the moment, we are little bit reluctant to share our data with the others, even if it is really a hindrance when it comes to the development of research activities. So these overseas organizations, sometimes depending on the loan schemes, but we should appreciate that there are grant schemes as well. They provide funding, they provide technology, even they provide experts to work on these projects. So that is how the foreign collaborations could bring in a lot of valuable feedback or information or collaborations into ongoing projects.
Thank you, Professor. And I think it's the last question I would like to again ask from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And sirs, I learned that there are several several science projects are going on through this Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's scattered through different ministries. So, is it possible to bring a cell or let's say a desk to coordinate all these activities by a single, let's say indirectly I can ask like you have the public diplomacy. So there's another, so like in terms of science diplomacy or something, that center initially, not a center, some cell which let's say, so sometime when we're dealing several regional initiatives, it's got duplicated and sometime each other doesn't know what's going on in the regional collaboration A and the B. The same member country will be representing in the both regional cooperations. A quick answer.
Yeah, Dr. Shami, I think your question is whether we can have a single cell or one division or one desk to coordinate science diplomacy. I think this is something which should be possible. I think you can make probably a proposal to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. You know, relatively recent introduction of a division in the ministry, like we have a division called Ocean Affairs Division. So it coordinates the issues of environment, oceans, and blue economy in the ministry. Likewise, probably you can make a proposal which the ministry hierarchy will take into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think that is our concluding this our forum on the discussions. But what we can say is a snapshot that during these discussions and the series of presentations, we thought that as a technical report, we will be able to produce a policy brief. So this all the conversation was recorded, and we will get it go through that, and we will back to you individually to verify your discussions and the comments. In the meantime, after having the discussion with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that's happy to hear that we can introduce as a course module in the diplomatics that we have to work, but happy to hear there's a possibilities on that one, but that is a one positive development and proposals we can take it the way forward. And that's a summary I think we will take, but once we will produce this policy brief, and we will ask all the online audience, and we're happy to hear nearly 300 online participants are there, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in abroad. And we ask all the participants, and we have a feedback form we emailed, and so we ask all of you to fill that feedback form, and we need your data to compile this policy brief. Also, the in-person participants, we would like to ask in your table, you can say scan QR code, and you can get fill your data, please. And that is one of our criteria for enable to provide the UNESCO embedded these certificates for your attendance and participations, and we will highly appreciate your feedback. Would help us to draft a policy brief as a technical output of this program. And thank you very much for all, and thank you, Madam and Sir, especially I would like to thankful our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they're very cooperative for this program. Also this panel, madam and sirs, and all online participants. And thank you very much. And I will hand over the podium to Nimshi.
Thank you very much. We would now like to welcome the Honorable Minister, Professor Krishant Abesena, and would like to thank him for participating even though you have a very busy schedule. Thank you so much, sir. And now, ladies and gentlemen, following an engaging discussion, we now move to our closing session on the way forward. It is my pleasure to invite Dr. Peter McGrath, coordinator of the Inter-Academy Partnership. Dr. McGrath is the coordinator of the Inter-Academy Partnership and leads its Trieste Secretariat, while also coordinating the Science and Diplomacy Initiative of the World Academy of Sciences. Holding a PhD from the University of Leeds, he began his career researching insect transmission of plant viruses before moving into science journalism. Since joining TWAS in 2003, he has managed key capacity building programs, including fellowships, research grants, and the Organization for Women in Science for the Developing World. He has also helped establish major international collaborations, such as the EU-funded Euro-Africa ICT and Horizon 2020 Science for Diplomacy projects. Through his roles at TWAS and IAP, Dr. McGrath continues to advance global cooperation in science education, diplomacy, and development. Dr. McGrath will speak on emerging opportunities in science diplomacy. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. I have been asked to give a sort of future perspective, if you like, for some of the things that have been discussed here today. I hope you'll understand. I'll try and share my screen. I prepared this PowerPoint a few days ago. I'm looking for my share screen here. So it covers, I think, some of the issues that have been discussed today, but maybe as I go through, I can go into more detail. So yes, if you look at the program, I am the Future Outlook discussant. So let's quickly recap on the definitions of science diplomacy. Sorry, I'm getting a little confused. Yes, here. And the new definition that has come out earlier this year, actually in March, is really called Science Diplomacy in an Era of Disruption. This is it's been alluded to, the new Royal Society AAAS definition that simplified the previous three-pillar dimensions of science diplomacy into two pillars, essentially. That science impacting diplomacy and diplomacy impacting science. And we've seen this image earlier from one of the previous speakers. At the same time, pretty much the same week, the EU published its framework for science diplomacy. It took the original three pillars and it actually added a fourth pillar. That again, Professor Zachary alluded to, this diplomacy in science. This is all to say that the precise definition of science diplomacy, there's no real formal agreement, but we all know what it is when we see it, I think. And we've heard many examples today from, many different countries, and of course many from Sri Lanka itself. The problem is always there, and again, even in the discussion just now, it's how do we get the diplomatic, the political community talking to the scientific community? And this is really where the science diplomacy operates in this overlap position. And as has also been recognized, in today's discussion and elsewhere, this is an area that has not been particularly populated in the past, but many countries are starting to understand that it's an area that needs to be supported. People need to be trained to operate here, to really sort of build these bridges between the two communities and help those bridges function well. So it's not that science and diplomacy are two incompatible fields. It might seem that way at times, but really the issues that we've been talking about, the SDGs, climate change, infectious diseases, these are things that we call wicked problems. And this means that they are not just simple problems or complicated problems that science can provide answers to, but they are more complex. Science can provide inputs with the best available evidence, but there are other inputs too. We've heard about economics. Politicians, of course, want to be re-elected. There is public opinion. There are many other factors that help develop the whatever decision, whatever policy comes out in answer to an issue. But of course, we as the scientific community will always argue that the decision makers cannot design the best policy without the scientific input. And this has also been touched on by Professor Fernando. I think she compared the global north with the global south. I think typically the science and technology capacity in the global south is less developed compared with the global north. The funding is not necessarily there. She alluded to the number of scientists per head of population, so even the scientific capacity is less developed. So how does a country like Sri Lanka and others in the region, in Africa, elsewhere, really start to implement science diplomacy in this space between science and diplomacy? And South-South collaboration can be another tool here, another implement that can help countries work together, develop solutions. What is developed in one country in the global south can be considered as a model in another country in the global south. So where do we go from here? What are some of the potential solutions? Let's take a look. And again, you'll have heard of, if you've been following through the day, a number of the proposals that I'm about to put on the table here. Looking at from this morning's session, it was 5 a.m. our time here in Italy, so I wasn't able to attend. But also this afternoon's session. The idea here is to really institutionalize science advice. How can we go ahead and do that? And you probably heard some mechanisms this morning. We've touched on some in this afternoon's presentations and discussions. This is Sir Peter Gluckman. He was the former science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. He's currently president of the International Science Council. Here's a quote. He gave a lecture here at TWAS some years ago, talking about small countries with strong voices. So New Zealand, maybe it has a more developed scientific environment, but it is really a small isolated country. And he was saying that as a small nation, we must compete hard to maintain our relevance in the world where we can easily be forgotten. We have to demonstrate that small countries can indeed make a difference. And I think this is a clarion call for a lot of nations, including Sri Lanka, that in order to make your voice heard, you have to set up the mechanisms in order to be able to do that, to not only compete on the global stage, but to have that voice heard and to influence the international discussions that are going on, such as the COP in Brazil and other such discussions. There are ways to do this. Here's one example. This is the Panama, for example. It's a tiny country in Central America. They understood quite early on the power of science diplomacy, and they have institutionalized a science diplomacy policy in their country from 2018. So this is it. If Sri Lanka does not have a formal science diplomacy policy, then there are examples out there that could be examined, potentially replicate or used as models. And we've seen also, this is from the European Union. I mean, of course, this is a collection of countries, so it's very difficult to have so many national science diplomacy strategies coalesced into a regional science diplomacy strategy. But that's what we've tried to do. We've alluded to this science diplomacy framework that was published earlier this year. And here's another one. We've talked earlier in the discussion session about getting modules or broader input of science diplomacy into the training of science or of diplomats, people being trained in diplomacy through your diplomatic academy. This is another alumni from Chile of our AAAS TWAS science diplomacy courses. He went back to Chile to become a co-founder of Diplocientífica. It's a science diplomacy network for Latin America and the Caribbean. And he was teaching science diplomacy at his university. And this came to the attention of the Diplomatic Academy in Santiago, who invited him to also teach a course on science diplomacy to the fledgling diplomats. So now every diplomat that graduates from the Diplomatic Academy of Santiago in Chile has a foundation training in science diplomacy. And I think this is a nice model to consider as well. There are other opportunities. I was in South Africa just about 3 weeks ago. I was invited by the Human Sciences Research Council to contribute to their very first science diplomacy training. They had a number of diplomats from some 30 African countries, or people working in the ministries of foreign affairs and so on. One of the recommendations here was to say that science diplomacy should be a part of continuing professional development. And this can be not only for scientists, but also for the diplomats, for those working in government ministries and so on. So it's not just a one-off training course, but something that happens every year, every 3 years, whatever it might be, keeping people up to date on topical science diplomacy issues that they might be dealing with, whether that's climate change or AI or whatever it might be. So where do we go? We've talked about institutionalizing science advice and then institutionalizing science diplomacy. And I've covered those 3 points: considering a national science diplomacy policy, introducing science diplomacy modules into the diplomatic academies, and introducing science diplomacy as a topic for continuing professional development. Today's events can be a springboard for future action, and we certainly hope this is not a one-off event, but it really leads to activities, actions that will take these ideas forward. One thing is training events for scientists and diplomats. I think we still have the TRAS director, Professor Knobel, online. One model we can think of here, we're working with Brazil at the moment, especially the state of Sao Paulo. And they are very interested in having, I mean, Sao Paulo, I don't know the details, but possibly is the size and the population of Sri Lanka. Very influential in science, the scientific environment in Brazil. But we're trying to bring Sao Paulo scientists or others that have been trained in Sao Paulo or have links to Sao Paulo projects with Brazilian diplomatic missions in Europe, in Geneva, in Paris, in Vienna, and so on, to really start linking those scientists with the diplomats in Europe, the embassies in Europe and elsewhere. So this is potentially a model we could discuss and try to take forward. Consider the regional level as well. You obviously, we've heard BIMSTEC mentioned, other regional initiatives for collaboration. These can be important venues for working with science diplomacy. And of course, you need to monitor your successes, assess your project, identify gaps so that these activities can be tailored and made more effective as you move forward. And with that, let me conclude. We've heard it said before, when it comes to tackling these wicked or complex global issues, no country can do it alone, and no country should want to do it alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McGrath, for those thoughtful insights on how science diplomacy can strengthen international collaboration and capacity building. Ladies and gentlemen, to close today's forum, may I now invite Ms. Geethani Kannangara, Director, International Relations, Ministry of Science and Technology, to deliver the word of thanks.
Minister of Science and Technology, Secretary Sir, distinguished speakers, panelists, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great privilege to deliver the vote of thanks at the conclusion of today's forum on the role of diplomacy in informed decision-making at the science policy interface. At the outset, I wish to extend our appreciation to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Employment and Tourism for their invaluable collaboration, and to UNESCO TAWAS for their partnership in organizing this important event. This forum, held in collaboration with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in partnership with UNESCO TAWAS, has brought together an exceptional group of international and national experts to share knowledge and experiences on advancing science diplomacy in Sri Lanka. I convey my heartfelt gratitude to our Honorable Minister of Science and Technology for gracing this occasion. We are honored by the participation of distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Sakari Abdul Hamid, whose thought-provoking address on collective cross-border STI efforts has provided clear direction for future global cooperation. Our sincere thanks also go to Dr. Timothy Curtis, Dr. Sirimali Fernando, Professor Marcelo Noble, and Dr. Peter McGrath for their insightful presentations that broadened our understanding in international collaboration, national perspectives, and the role of science diplomacy in evidence-based policy making. I extend my sincere appreciation to our session moderator, Mr. Said Shami, for his skillful and engaging moderation. Finally, I thank all international and local participants, both in person and online, for their active engagement. Today's forum has clearly shown that science diplomacy is not merely a dialogue, it's a pathway to build trust, partnerships, and solutions for shared global challenges. Let us continue to build on the momentum generated here today towards a more collaborative and knowledge-driven future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kannangara. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our workshop and forum discussion on science diplomacy. Today, we have reaffirmed that diplomacy informed by science and science guided by diplomacy is the path to informed decisions, sustainable development, and shared progress. On behalf of the organizing ministries, we extend our heartfelt appreciation to all dignitaries, speakers, panelists, and participants, both on-site and online. May today's conversations continue to shape Sri Lanka's journey in global scientific cooperation. Thank you, everyone, and have a pleasant evening.